And I always have a lot to talk about with my next guest. He's been on the show a number of times. We always look forward to having him, Danny Sjursen. We've introduced him in the past on this program as Major Danny Sjursen. He is out of the armed forces now and writing about his experiences in a more personal way. So I wanted to talk to him about that, as well as a couple of other recent developments in the foreign policy slash military strategy world. So maybe we'll get to all of that in the conversation that ensues. But first of all, Danny Sjursen, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be on. This is the first time I'll be on where I don't have to lead off with a disclaimer. So I am, as always, speaking for myself, but now I can say anything I want.
All right, good. Well, what have you wanted to say all this time that you haven't been able to say because you are a member of the armed forces?
Well, I certainly wanted to be more critical of some of the domestic and foreign policy of the president. I've already been critical, but I've always had to be careful not to be, quote, contemptuous, which is a very subjective terminology, and it has kept me from calling out some of the bigotry, racism, and white nationalism of the commander-in-chief. But now I'm quite ready to do that. I think it displays itself internally in domestic policy as well as externally, and we see that in the bullying that's going on once again in Central and South America.
Absolutely. And just to be clear for our listeners who might not know, when you're in the armed forces, you're in a chain of command that ends with or begins with the President of the United States. So to speak of him, quote unquote, contemptuously, however you define that, is to the argument is it undermines the chain of command, right?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, I had to take about 4 months off of writing last year, as you remember, because I was under investigation for contemptuous words against the president and the Secretary of Defense. Now, luckily, I was essentially exonerated and got back to work. But yeah, they put me on a freeze order. So, writing while on active duty, it's rare and it's difficult.
Yeah, well, good for you for doing it. You showed a lot of courage in doing it, and I want to talk to you a little more about that as our conversation unfolds. I also, by the way, you had a heck of a challenge writing about the policies and behavior of this president without displaying what might be called contempt, given the contemptible nature of so many of his policy and personal decisions. That must have been a tough tightrope to walk.
Yeah, it truly was. I mean, just being unable to call out some of the nepotism in the administration, some of the racism that really just encapsulates so much of what this president does, both at home and abroad, was very, very difficult. And I'm glad to be able to speak out, not because I want to show contempt for any public figure, but because I want to speak truth to power. And I've tried to do that while in uniform. And now that I'm out, now that I'm retired, I hope to do it even more, because that truly is patriotism.
There's no question about it that it is patriotism. And just to continue on the Trump thread a little bit, taking as completely an apolitical stand as I possibly can, and obviously, if you know anything about me, I'm a political creature in many ways, but I am capable of thinking apolitically. And from my most apolitical point of view, the one thing that was promising, maybe promising is an overly strong word, but interesting about Donald Trump, the candidate, and in my view, one of the reasons why he won and became president is that he challenged the military and national security orthodoxy of this country's political and media and military elites, in my opinion. When he ran for president, he challenged the idea that we needed to be in Iraq. He stated falsely, but he stated that he had always been against the invasion of Iraq, that he felt we didn't need to maintain what you or I might describe as an empire, the bases around the world, the massive military presence in so many countries. And in that sense, he was a very unorthodox mainstream politician. I can't think of a presidential candidate from either party or senator, for that matter, who had challenged the foreign policy orthodoxy in quite that way. So, and I do believe that helped him get elected. Now, he hasn't governed in the same way, has he?
No, and it's a shame because I've given the credit to the president where it's been due. And actually, some of my worst attacks have come from the left, which is odd because if I had to pigeonhole myself, I'm probably a progressive. But I took a lot of flack from the left when I actually said Donald Trump was doing the right thing or saying the right things, specifically getting out of Syria, getting out of Afghanistan, pulling out some of the presence in Iraq. There was an earthy common sense to some of the things he said, even if his language was a little bellicose, even if his language was a little crude. And I was willing to say, hey, look, he's doing the right thing here, or he's talking about doing the right thing. But he has not governed in that way. We're still in all of those places. And for every country he wants to pull out of, let's say Syria, there's more martial threats towards other countries full of brown folks, whether it be Venezuela or Iran. So, 6 1, half dozen the other. I mean, I don't think there's a consistency to this man's foreign policy. I don't think there's a consistency to the man's policy whatsoever, so far as I can tell. And that's one of the more dangerous things.
And to me, and I'm curious to know, I think what you ran afoul of, and I've struggled, I've had a problem with it from time to time too. I think what you ran afoul of is a mistake that people who are, strongly democratic in their leanings can sometimes make, which is anything that Trump does or says or implies is inherently wrong. It gets to be a challenge. We talk about global trade policy on this show. Well, the fact is Trump also said some things that made some sense about global trade policy. Now, he doesn't seem to be following through on them, very astutely there either. But the fact is he understood what the American people want. He kind of pitched them on it. And the idea that people, because they've personalized their hatred towards Trump, sometimes I think they then stumble into the trap of thinking, well, what we need back is the same old consensus, bipartisan consensus that got us into all these military adventures, that built this costly and counterproductive empire around the world, that did these bad trade deals that strengthened corporate wealth and weakened sovereign nations and individual peoples and labor movements and on, environmental movements and so on. And so I think we've got to, get away from the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thinking and get it to really talking about the issues that matter.
Totally agree. I think the last thing that we need in foreign policy, and I say this with an eye to 2020, the last thing we need in foreign policy is the old Clinton, Bush, Obama machine. And a lot of people would take issue with me throwing those three together. But if you look at the way they conducted foreign policy, especially after 9/11, there's more similarity than difference. Okay, I would argue that some of the differences are actually one of degree, not one of overall policy. So, the last thing we need is an establishment presidential candidate, maybe I'm thinking of Joe Biden here, who voted for the Iraq War, who's been on the wrong side of history in almost every major foreign policy debacle of the last 18 years. So, I think we need in both parties, but especially in the Democratic Party, some new blood, some new ideas, and something totally new on foreign policy because, hey, folks, what we've been doing, it ain't working. And the evidence is there.
And you know what? I think the people know, I think on a gut level, the American people get that it's not working. It's not working for the global security of humanity, and it's not working for this country either. So I think that the politician that articulates that is going to win. And I couldn't agree with you more, Danny Sjursen, because I think that if the Democrats put up somebody like somebody who reflects that consensus, potentially Joe Biden or a younger version of Joe Biden with more hair or whatever they decide to do, that if they put up somebody who restates those old arguments, I think that will increase the possibility that Trump wins again, because Trump is certainly willing to pivot again, like he pivoted after he got elected, and start talking against those overextended and broken policies. So I completely agree with you there. And I guess I would add to that also that what Democrats, if for people who think of themselves as progressives, my message is always, if you be progressive in foreign policy too, don't just think that progressivism is economic policy here at home or social justice policy here at home, although those things are, to me, extremely important. It's also about not invading or destabilizing a nation like Venezuela. It's also about making sure we're not triggering new wars in the Middle East as we did in the Syria, Libya, Iraq area, and then using the new wars and violence that result from our actions as an excuse to take further actions of a similar kind. Does that make sense to you?
Totally makes sense. And I think we saw many establishment Democrats falling for the trap of just going against anything Trump did or said when we saw people like Rachel Maddow, who knows better over at MSNBC. She really does know better, defending, keeping troops in Syria, keeping troops almost indefinitely in Afghanistan. Somehow, MSNBC starts inviting these recycled neocons onto their shows to say, look, Trump's wrong. And there's this strange alliance between what people think of as the establishment left with the neoconservative Bush era right was really staggering. It's really scary. And to kind of leave this issue behind, I want to agree with you. It is a losing formula for 2020 because Trump will eat that up and walk all over such policies.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I want to talk a little bit now. I want to change gears a little bit. And again, we're talking with Danny Sjursen, formerly Major Danny Sjursen, former U.S. Army strategist, former history instructor at West Point. I want to talk to you about a couple things that are closer to home. One is PTSD, because you wrote about that. And then the other is your own journey to becoming the thinker and essentially, at one point, dissident Army officer, almost, I might describe you as. But I first want to talk about PTSD because you wrote a really brave piece about that I admire you for putting on paper. And by the way, as someone who has suffered from PTSD and never written about it, I particularly appreciate your courage in putting it on paper. But and I never suspected in our many conversations, but why would I, that this was something you struggle with, and I guess you're right, as a product of your deployments. All right, so are you comfortable talking about that a little bit?
Of course. I spent 30 days, pretty much the entire month of February, down in Arizona at a treatment facility for a variety of types of diagnoses, but PTSD was the main one that I had been diagnosed with, and many of the military folks there, I would say about 40% of the people in the program were military, were suffering from some form of PTSD, and then the ancillary sort of diagnoses of depression, anxiety, and sometimes substance abuse. And it was a really informative time, not only because I got a lot of treatment that I couldn't get in an outpatient facility, but because I met an entire generation of the silent wounded of these wars on terror, sort of the refuse of wars that didn't need to be fought. One of the things that I saw was that these kinds of silent wounds are harder for people to talk about than gunshots. Physical wounds are horrible. Many of my soldiers have been maimed, lost limbs, but there's a certain degree of honor that society places upon the physically wounded. And what we have is hundreds of thousands more Americans suffering from PTSD and everything that kind of follows. And I saw the scope of this with veterans from the Army, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, reserves, veterans, active duty, retired, and realized, wow, this is an epidemic. And all war creates what used to be called shell shock, what was then called combat fatigue, what's finally called PTSD. But I would argue, and I don't know if there's science behind this, but wars that don't end, wars that don't culminate in victory, that seem to go on without purpose, they create their own psychological problems unique to those sorts of veterans. And I would argue that what we're seeing is at least partly a product of America's perpetual ill-advised wars.
There's a lot to that, I think, and a lot worth exploring, Danny. And in my own case, my own problems stemmed from some extreme violence I experienced when I was a child. But in treatment for it, I came across, in fact, I was advised to read a book called Trauma and Recovery by Dr. Judith Herman, who's a psychiatrist. And one of the things, and I got a lot out of it, but one of the things that Dr. Herman says is that one of the best ways to recover from trauma is by putting your experience to work, helping others, telling your story, having a story that resolves and then putting it to work helping others. And it seems to me that if it's for a war that hasn't been, that seems to go on indefinitely, that the possibility of closure, the possibility of resolution in any way, including acceptance of quote unquote defeat, might be that much harder. And if people, in essence, have shunted you off to the side as a full human being because they don't want to confront the implications of what they've done in sending you to war, if they, and they, you know, in other words, they're happy to kind of celebrate you when they see you in an airport and say thank you for your service, but they really don't want to think about what's happening to you, that also might create a kind of social isolation. And I don't know if any of what I've just said made sense to you, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I totally think it makes sense. Look, there's a reason why veterans find their way onto the 50-yard line for the NFL and get thanked in airports and get a lot of bumper stickers put up. You know, there's a lot of reasons for that. But there's also a reason why the children of congressmen, of senators, of even lawyers and doctors, you know, they're not undergoing PTSD in large numbers from these wars because they don't get sent. Okay, their parents don't want to deal with the outcomes of these wars. It's one thing for another person's child to do it, right? A rural, poorer, you know, in many cases, browner person to take on this responsibility for the United States. But look, the elites aren't serving in this war. It's not like World War II, where Harvard had as many graduates die as West Point. Those days are gone. And so, you know, I think what you're saying is absolutely valuable. And we have to note that we've taken a specific caste, and I use that word very carefully, of American society, a military caste, and inflicted these wounds for wars that, like you said, and like I've said many times, continue indefinitely without even any sense of worth. For me, I knew that it was time to start dissenting when I could no longer look a mother or a wife in the eyes and honestly tell her what her son, her spouse died for. That moment was pivotal in my life, and it really has informed everything I've done since.
So how does a person, you in this case, knit yourself together? In other words, you have this experience of, I assume when you went into the service, you believed in the mission, you wanted to carry out the mission, you had a period of gradual disillusionment culminating with your inability to, look the wives and mothers of guys you had lost in the faith and tell them that they died for a good cause. How do you then yourself take that thread of a narrative that you lived by and risked your life by and reweave it into something else that gives your life meaning?
Well, first of all, it took time. In the initial stages, I ignored the problem. You know, my son is named Alexander after my favorite soldier, Alex Fuller, who was killed on January 25th, 2007. And what I did, and what I'm ashamed of what I did, is I ignored his widow for nearly 10 years. You know, I couldn't bring myself to call her. So that's part of what I did. Self-medication from alcohol. Okay, was definitely played a role. And let me tell you, from spending that time in Arizona, it plays a massive role among our veterans today. But then eventually I was saved by the writing. You know, what started out as angry essays ended up a book, and, you know, from the book came my weekly columns. And I realized that, look, I don't have certain skills. I'll never sing and dance, and I can't write poetry, but I can tell truth to power. I can craft prose that makes sense to most of a public audience. And it changed everything for me. It gave me the courage eventually to speak to some of those family members that I couldn't in the past. And it led me to a place where I could publicly air these grievances. And in a sense, that's been cathartic. So look, the military, I will mourn the loss of my military career. You know, I will mourn retiring, even though I turned so far against these wars. The military is an identity. It's not just a job. It gives you value and purpose. Well, now I've found a new identity, okay? An identity in dissent, an identity in writing and in speaking. And it saved me to find that new identity, because without it, I don't know who I would be at the end of 18 or 20 or 25 years of service. Probably a shell of a man.
There's so much in what you just said. First of all, the self-medication piece, which, by the way, I also know a little bit about, since I haven't had a drink of alcohol since April 7th, 1995, and hope to keep that up a little while longer. So at least a day, and maybe more. So I get that. I really get that. And I think that I think as far as the military giving you purpose, I understand that too, even though I didn't serve in the military. And I understand, I have the sense that a lot of people lack that sense of higher purpose, that sense of community, that sense of belonging, that sense of self-sacrifice, the opportunity to sacrifice yourself for a higher, and I don't mean your life necessarily, but your efforts and your, to a higher purpose. I think a lot of people are missing that. I think it's a vacuum in our world as it exists. I think it's one reason why a lot of people of later generations kind of look back longingly at what's called the greatest generation. I mean, I think any generation has the potential to be the greatest generation if that generation understands what its purpose is. So I get that. And I also understand, the sense of finding purpose in dissent. I think it's a noble calling. But what I struggle with in the world of dissent and and I've worked in movement activities before, and I've found it to a certain extent there, or when I was working for Bernie Sanders or whatever. But this sense that of community and higher purpose, where people get together not online, but in the real world, and reinforce each other and strength. And online helps, but reinforce and strengthen one another in their purpose. And I don't know what your thoughts are about community as a dimension of higher purpose.
Well, absolutely. The movement, so to speak, that you've described, whether that be, on the side of writing or of actual activism, can help, like the military, to fill in the gap of a vapid consumerist life. And that's the reality of America in the 21st century. Okay, in the online world, in the world of the isolated nuclear family, and the end of the extended family, and the end of national service, and all these things that we look back fondly upon for the greatest generation, the lack of those very things is part of what makes the military identity and the military life so just attractive. But what I agree with is that we have to find something else, because in the end, the society that places its soldiers at the top of the moral hierarchy is doomed. Okay, so the society that only trusts its military, look at the polls. We don't trust Congress. We don't trust the courts. We don't trust the media. We only trust the military. Heck, we don't even trust priests anymore, right, for good reason. So that's dangerous. And what I want is for us to take a new sense of service, right? A new sense of service to community as the meaning that fits into that life. And so what I would like to see is teachers and social workers and nurses on the 50-yard line, okay, or activists of some other type, because the military shouldn't be the only way to find an identity and to serve, the nation and society.
Well, this is something I actually talk about a lot with friends, and some of us are actually remember a period of time. For example, I was a child in the 1960s, but I remember it well, for example. And a time when there was a phrase that was common in the vernacular that you never hear anymore, Danny Sjursen, and the phrase was public service. People would say, "Oh, what does your son do? Oh, or your daughter do? Oh, she went into public service. She's working for Vista, or she's a social worker, or she's a teacher, or he's a, whatever." Yeah, and you don't. That whole notion that working for the higher good, whether it was in a government job or a public interest agency or something else, somewhere, I think it was along the line at the time of the Reagan counter-revolution, where all of a sudden, he popularized this pernicious myth that government is the enemy of the people. I think, government is the servant in a democracy. Government is supposed to be the expression of the people. So I think somewhere along the line, we lost the sense of ourselves as a national community as a result of that. And we don't reinforce that behavior anymore. So if what you're doing now, if part of what you're doing now is reinforcing this ideal of service in a broader capacity, including putting teachers and social workers and firefighters and a bunch of other people on the front line, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. I think that the Reagan revolution that essentially scapegoated government and public servants and put them at the bottom of the social hierarchy almost as losers, right? That way that Reagan sold it to the people and that the populace really bought it, so much so that the accumulation of wealth and the consumption of wealth, right, has become a golden calf, okay, a temple at which we worship, and a society that is obsessed with celebrity and with athletics. I mean, these are symptoms of a broader problem. So I agree with you. Let's bring back public service, okay, as something to be respected, honored, and sought after. And again, it can't be just the military. But today, scarily, it is. It is the only public institution that people trust.
Well, and I feel that scarily is the right word, and that's not, it's not an attack on, certainly not on the men and women of our armed forces, but this, I feel as if across the political spectrum in this country, we don't just trust the military. We fetishize it. We make it, an object of unquestioning. I'll give you an example. I was very disturbed when people started talking about the Democrats in particular, how happy they were, and the kind of MSNBC folks you were talking about earlier, how happy they were that Trump had generals in the room when he originally hired General Mattis and General Kelly and so on. Oh, thank God he's got some generals in the room. They'll keep things sane. Well, first of all, personally, I certainly, especially General Kelly, he turned out to have some reprehensible views, in my opinion, which didn't entirely surprise me. General Mattis had written that very interesting book, Dereliction of Duty, that I noted at the time about officers' responsibility to question orders during Vietnam if they didn't seem to make sense. But that said, I think that this idea, I'm afraid that a lot of people in this country, including people who consider themselves liberals, at this point would welcome a military junta, for example, if it promised to relieve them from Trump. And I think that's a scary day for democracy if it turns out to be true.
100% agree. It is a sad state of affairs. Pity the nation that puts its generals on a pedestal above other servants, especially a nation that ostensibly prides itself on civilian control of the military. Look, we can't fetishize the military. The military should be considered only one of many ways to serve one's nation, and it should only be used as a last resort. The men of violence should be held back until there is a real threat and the actual act of diplomacy, which is a lost art, has been exhausted. So I, too, was extremely worried when the supposed opposition left was fetishizing the generals and calling them, quote, the adults in the room. What a sad state of affairs. That's a scary moment and hopefully one that we can get away from in the next administration in 2020.
One of the guys, I mentioned that I gave up drinking, one of the guys who helped me navigate that, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago, had served in World War II, and he always used to say that the reason why people think that way is because so few people in these classes, just as you were mentioning, have served in the military. He said, World War II, we always knew the generals were full of blank. He was like, they had this sort of irreverent, they saw them at work. They didn't put them on a pedestal because they knew that they were as human as anybody else and as ambitious and as self-serving or whatever. And so that wouldn't have happened, was his theory, at a time when more people served in the military, when it was more of a genuinely democratic experience. But all right, so here we are, and you are now a civilian, free to say what you want. What are your 2, 3 issues you're going to be honing in on in your writing in the next year or two as we head into this, and I cover my head to say it, this next election?
It's amazing that the election cycles begin earlier and earlier every year. Okay, three things, okay, in the interest of time. Number one, first, the dismantling of the wars that we are currently in, okay? So getting out as quickly and as responsibly as possible from these wars, okay? Not making excuses for why we have to stay. That's one. Then it's dismantling the military-industrial complex. Look, that's a generational challenge, but it has to start now. The pernicious influence of the arms dealers has to stop, and their control of Congress. And finally, rerouting that money, okay? Rerouting the windfall to investment in our domestic priorities, whether that's infrastructure or the safety net. Look, a country is judged ultimately by how it treats the least among them. That would be the Christian way, and that is the way I believe that a society should work. So let's end these wars. Let's take the $6 trillion we wasted. Let's find another way to spend it in the next generation.
Well said. And we can leave it there. Danny Sjursen, former Army major, writer, advocate. Thanks so much for your great writing in recent weeks, as always, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks, as always. Absolutely a pleasure.